Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. They offer free checking with industry-leading mobile banking. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Visit firstbank.com to learn more.
What's up, Hokie Nation, and welcome into episode 412 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC, for now, have resolved their legal dispute. We're going to talk all about that, what it means for the ACC, and what it means for Virginia Tech. That'll get started on episode 412 of the Tech Sideline Podcast that begins right now. We're recording on Wednesday, March 5th, 2025 from our high-tech studio in the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center. Remember to like, subscribe, and refer the show to a friend. I'm your host, Carter Hill, filling in for Giovanni Heater. To my right is our lead analyst and columnist, Chris Coleman. Across the way is our senior staff writer, Andy Bitter. In the fourth chair is TSL founder and general manager, Will Stewart. And our director of media, Nick Brown, is producing behind the scenes. Guys, good to see everybody. I know we've done some basketball stuff throughout the year, but talking, I guess, a little bit of football, and then also this whole legal matter for now has been resolved between the ACC, Florida State, and Clemson. Kind of an interesting podcast, but should be an interesting discussion for sure.
These days, it seems like we can't have an off season without something big happening when it comes to the fabric of college sports, or even at the conference level these days. And so we saw what came out yesterday with the ACC, and I know everybody's got various opinions on it, and we'll talk about it today. I think, to me, the bigger question is what happens 5 years from now, but sure, we'll get into that later.
Off season. There has been no off season.
You're right.
So there was a 6-week coordinator search on defense. You think you're done on signing day. Then there's an offensive coordinator search. It's early March, and they're still shuffling staff responsibilities around, and they start spring ball in about a week and a half here, 2 weeks. So there's been no offseason. It's just kept going since the end of the year.
Andy, I thought about you a couple weeks ago when Tech and UVA played in Blacksburg, and there was like this little scuffle in the tunnel, and I'm like, how would you categorize this little pushing and shoving event? I don't know if you ever saw.
I didn't see that. I don't know. I don't know. Was it a kerfuffle?
Okay.
Was it a brouhaha? I don't think it elevates to that level.
Wasn't brouhaha.
It wasn't a
status,
brouhaha.
no.
What do you think, Chris?
Was
What
it
do
a
you think?
fracas?
Kerfuffle is probably more accurate.
Yeah. A skirmish, yeah.
Minor skirmish.
I'd have to call up the I bookmarked it somewhere, the list of things, the order of events, but I'd have to consult somebody to see if that was where that falls on the chart.
Okay. All right. Well, again, Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC for now have resolved their legal dispute that has been going on for seems like almost a year now, maybe over a year with Florida State as well. Clemson came in a little bit later too, but seems like it has been resolved for the moment. I think there is, to your point, Chris, some overarching questions about what it means for the ACC, but just kind of take everybody through the details of what we know so far and what it means for everybody involved.
I think Andy knows the more details because he just wrote a huge article about it.
Yes.
But as far as
well, I could start off with the details of it, just so we can introduce the listeners to it before we get into the discussion.
You're more knowledgeable.
These are the main points of it. It ends the litigation that was against the ACC. There were ongoing lawsuits in South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, all challenging the veracity of the grant of rights. Those are now been dropped. The league is introducing a new revenue distribution model that takes 60% of the TV money, and it is going to be weighted on a rolling average of viewers who watch football and men's basketball games. So the bigger brands, the ones that are more viewed on TV, will get a bigger slice of the revenue pie. In the past, all that had been uniform, equal. So in addition to the success initiatives that they've had before, there's going to be a pretty big disparity in what teams can get paid within the ACC's TV deal. An exit fee has been established for 2025 and 2026 of $165 million. That lowers by $18 million each year until 2030 and 31 when it stays at $75 million. That's the exit fee from that point forward. If a school pays the exit fee, they leave with their media rights intact. That was sort of a question before. Even if you exit, does the league still own your media rights? Beyond that has sort of prevented anybody from even exploring an option of going to another conference. That's now been resolved. So before there wasn't really a number, or if there was, it was sort of a interpretation of what the number should be. Now there's a definite number that's out there, and it's certainly a lot lower than what a lot of people thought it might be.
So are you surprised by this at all? Like, to me, when all this came to light, what was there to resolve? Now we're kind of seeing what has been bearing of fruits of this whole legal process over the last couple of months. And it seems like maybe it creates some stability for the ACC right now, but long term, how is this good for the conference is probably the best possible question.
Well, I don't think this conference has had a long term, whether you're talking 2031 or 2036. Fact of the matter is, if Florida State and Clemson, and anybody, quite frankly, could find a safe landing spot, they would probably leave. I don't think it's going to make it that far, as Andy talked about in his article, which everyone should subscribe and read because it's fantastic. I think, there are still multiple changes coming in college football. And more realignment will come along with that. I don't think it's going to be the ACC that forces it, though. Oh, Florida State and Clemson are available, so let's add them. I don't know that there's going to be any more adding. I don't know if this changes anything long term for the ACC. Okay. I don't know if it changes anything long term for Virginia Tech. It changes some things in the short term about how the money is going to be divvied up. I do think that gives that is a built-in advantage to Miami and Clemson. They're bigger brands, of course, but they also have a crossover game every year that a lot of people watch. Like Florida State plays Florida every year, and a lot of people will watch that. And obviously South Carolina and Clemson. More eyeballs will be on those games.
Oh, Virginia Tech has ODU.
That's right. Yeah. We have ODU, and that's why I've always said we should never drop the West Virginia series, but, here we are. Need to get them back on the schedule, but just looking at their future schedules page, they're already playing UVA twice in Charlotte. They're playing Tennessee in Charlotte. They got a home-and-home with Alabama. They've got Pitt back on the schedule. So now would be the perfect time to schedule West Virginia because higher TV ratings you get, the more money you make. But I don't think Virginia Tech can do that right now. Now, if they hadn't canceled the series in the first place, we wouldn't be in that situation. That's another topic, though. But I think it's going to vary some on a year-to-year basis. I think it's going to be very good for Tech this year. They play South Carolina in a non-conference game. And Vanderbilt, yeah. But I mean, that should be an ESPN game. Certainly, it shouldn't be an ACC network game, whose numbers we never know because the ACC never releases. Who do they have? They've got do they play Miami next year?
Virginia
Tech. Play Miami every year.
Every year.
Yeah,
every year now.
That's
right. That's right.
It's hard to remember what scheduling model they were.
Oh my God!
It went away for a second. Now it's back every year.
3-3-5 for one singular year, and now that's in the past.
Yep. So I think this will be a good year for Virginia Tech. But then you look at 2026, and you've got Old Dominion, you've got James Madison, you've got VMI on the schedule.
Maryland.
Yeah, I mean, right. That's a road game. Who knows what channel it'll be on?
Well, now, wait a minute. The listeners may not have heard Nick. He said Maryland.
They play in Maryland. Yep, 2026.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think you're going to see some more variance. You can help yourself by being as good as possible, and that way more people will want to watch your games.
Yeah.
But overall, though, I just don't think this has a long-term effect on where things are going in the ACC or in college sports in general.
Yeah, I think with Virginia Tech, the viewership numbers thing is people are going to watch who they're going to watch. I think the year-to-year variance just based on schedules, especially with this weighted average on it, I don't think it's going to change too much over time. And there are, brands and schools that get a lot more TV traction. And, how are they going to do that? It's like, well, they got a lot more viewers. It's like, okay, well, they also got to be shown on ABC versus ESPNU or whatever. So it's tough to balance that. And I don't think there's going to be balance in that. And that's why, Clemson, Florida State, Miami, as much as people, they've underachieved for 25 years here, people still watch Miami, still watch the heck out of Miami. So these are going to be schools that can benefit from this viewership model here. I think, bigger picture, I think this is such a victory for Florida State and Clemson. who, stomped their feet and cried foul and yelled to the heavens about how unfair this whole thing was. And they went to court and everybody kind of made fun of them. And they came out on the other end of this looking like they got everything they wanted. Mm-hmm. They got an unequal revenue distribution, which is what they wanted. They wanted a firm number of what it would cost to get out of the ACC. In the past, everybody's like, oh, I don't know if they'd want to, if other conferences want them and stuff like that. It's like, well, you never really knew because they didn't have a clear path out of the ACC. Now they know exactly what it would cost. And, if they want to leave and then another conference all of a sudden says, oh, you're going to retain your TV rights, that's a lot more attractive to them than before, where it's, well, you might not have them until 2036. And even if you do, there's going to be a lot of legal hassles that go along with this. And we don't want to be sued for trying to break up a conference or something like that. I think you eliminate all that. And that's a big win for these schools that have options out there. On the flip side of it, the ACC, I think you look at this and you go, this feels like a capitulation. Like, why are they doing this? A couple reasons, I haven't talked to anybody that has confirmed this or anything like this, but you look at it from 10,000 feet, the legal costs were soaring with this thing. I mean, it costs a lot to fight this in court. It's an ugly, bad look for the league to have this infighting like this. There's not really stability to it and structure. And I think, finding some sort of relative peace, no matter how long that lasts, is probably something that was appealing for a lot of schools and school presidents that just kind of wanted to stop this whole infighting with this thing. Probably tells me that maybe they didn't like their standing in the legal battle. I think there were a lot of assumptions that this grant of rights was going to be ironclad and, nobody could pierce this thing if they took it to court. Well, as somebody who's been in court situations for some stupid crap before, I can tell you that it matters what court you're in, what judge you get, what location. There's a lot of ifs and there's a lot of uncertainty with that. And sometimes you don't want to, put the dice on the table for a situation like that. And, lastly, I think this gives the league a little bit of time of relative peace here. Could Clemson or Florida State or some of the crazies in the athletic departments there pony up $165 million and get out tomorrow? Sure. Probably could happen. I doubt it in the current state. And I think when you look at when these TV deals expire, that sort of is what is pushing expansion in a lot of these conferences. 2030, 2031 is around the time frame when that's all going to happen.
So that's Big Ten contract, college
Big
football
Ten expires
playoff.
in 2030, Big 12's in 2031, and college football contracts up in 2031.
Okay.
So it's all around sort of the same time. The SEC, I think, goes through 2034 or something like that. But I think in a couple years you'll see that, which gives the ACC, 5-6 years here to maybe just sort of see how things go and, come up with a plan for the future, maybe regroup, maybe enjoy some relative peace and security for a while. And, honestly, they've put these incentives out there that, if you do well enough and enough people watch you, Clemson had a presentation that said they could get up to $120 million more over a 6-year period. So you're talking about $20 million in success initiatives, viewership, splits that would be beneficial. And that's even before you get to potential college football playoff monies that are coming in there. I mean, all of a sudden that gap between the Big Ten and the SEC and the top end ACC schools isn't so large. Do you want to go somewhere else when you have this path to the playoff that's a little bit easier? What's around you in this situation. You're making okay money, maybe not as much, but pretty good money in that situation. Maybe the ACC has given them an option to not have to go elsewhere.
And just like Florida State and Clemson, Andy Bitter came out on the other side on top of his court situation. So
that's right.
What a comparison there.
Still tweeting off this trash Twitter accounts all these years later. So,
Will, what do you have to add about this whole situation in the fourth chair?
So a couple of things. David Hale, I can't take credit for this notion. It's from David Hale. David Hale and others have estimated, so now that a school like Florida State or Clemson can come within $7 to $15 million in media rights of Big Ten and SEC schools. So they're not all the way there, but at least they're not 20 to 30 million behind annually, which is what started this whole kerfluffle or Donnybrook or whatever you want to call it. So Hale made the point that let's say you get 5 years out and Florida State and Clemson, we'll hold them up as the example, are making almost as much money as the SEC and the Big Ten. Would the Big Ten or the SEC invite either one of them with a full revenue share If the answer to that is no, then it's not to your monetary advantage to leave.
Right.
And Hale also raised the point that you are in an ACC where you are getting a lot more money than the other schools in the conference. You have a advantageous path to make it to the college football playoff. In other words, it's just a pretty sweet setup if you get 5 years down the road. And depending upon how all this stuff plays out, it might not be that great for either one of them to go somewhere else at that point in time.
I agree, though. Like, where are these schools really going to go? I know, like, Florida State and Clemson are huge brands. I would argue that Carolina, though you don't have the football giant, Carolina is obviously a massive national attractive brand as well. Maybe to UVA, or maybe to some people, UVA is as well. You have Miami on the football side of things. There are some attractive schools in the ACC for other conferences, but with how big these conferences have gotten, where realistically are these schools going to go if it's not a conference like the Big 12, where really where is the extra advantage over the ACC at this point?
Yeah, I think if you're the SEC and the Big 10, you're already rolling in it. Like, anybody you add needs to increase the pie for everyone, right? And
It's not their mouth at the trough.
exactly. And even for a school, even like especially for the SEC, who already have those states in the South, would adding them make any difference? You could argue that it expands the Big Ten's market and things like that. I think we've seen conferences get just about as big as they're going to get. I think you'll continue to see realignment, but I think that'll be like, I mean, Andy wrote about it again. It's a great Q&A. Everyone should go in and read it. Basically, what the ACC is doing right now is a testing ground for all the other leagues. Okay, so now that the revenue is going to be split unequally, and Boston College is going to be getting less because nobody watches them, and that's going to be the same. Like, the Big Ten's going to be watching this and be like, okay, why are we splitting revenue with Purdue? Why are they getting as much TV money as Ohio State, right? Or why is
Rutgers, Maryland.
Right.
Big Ten's got a lot of dead weight. A lot of dead weight. And, even in the SEC, you've got Vanderbilt and I guess probably Mississippi State is your two
Both
teams.
Mississippi's
Yeah, probably so.
not huge draws. Missouri, I mean, they're somewhat newcomer, but it's like that was in an age where it's like geography mattered.
Right. Geography doesn't matter so much
Missouri
anymore.
and Texas, obviously, Texas A&M coming in. But I mean, man, talk about Rutgers and Maryland hitting the lottery, like right time, right place to get into the Big Ten. But yeah, to your point, like it's like why at a certain point, I think the Michigans and Ohio States and Alabamas and LSUs of the world are going to go, why are we splitting equal revenue with all these smaller school teams? Especially now there's a blueprint out there for it with the ACC. So right now, I feel like the ACC, the top teams in the ACC have caught up and closed that gap. But what if the Big Ten and the SEC do that as well? And all of a sudden that creates a disparity again. I think that could kind of, put things in motion again once you get to this, next inflection point of conference realignment that I would think this is around 2030, 2031. It always happens a little bit before that in anticipation of these changes. But, for the next couple of years, I feel like there might not be a ton of movement, even though this opens a door for it. I just don't know that it happens. I feel like the only school that's out there that would move the needle this much, that would absolutely be a no-brainer to take, is Notre Dame. And they don't want to join a conference. So, who's doing it? Who's getting that kind of money and increasing the TV revenue pot so much that it's advantageous for everybody else in the league? Because the last couple editions that we've had, you look at Oregon, you look at Washington, they came in at a heavy discount. I mean, SMU was so desperate to join a power conference. They're like, we'll pay our way for like 30 years. We don't care. Like, we have oil money. We do not care about this. Cal and Stanford were just like, just give us a seat. We'll sit in, coach in the back and not raise many questions about this whole thing. So I feel like they have tapped a lot of the schools that would increase the revenue pot enough to make it worthwhile, that I don't know if they're going to continue to do that.
And I will say, I think this is a tremendous opportunity. If Virginia Tech gets its act together, if they start winning football games, if the athletic department is run properly, I admit all these things are big ifs, but if you go back to when Virginia Tech was in the Big East, and there was unbalanced revenue sharing in the Big East, not in terms of television money, but in terms of bowl money, right? The bowl money, in the ACC, is, it goes back to the league offices and is kind of distributed evenly, basically. In the Big East, whatever bowl you went to, you got to keep a good chunk of it. So when Virginia Tech went to back-to-back Alliance Bowls in 95 and 96, and then another one in 1999, they got, I want to say, what, you got like $7 million was the payout for the Sugar Bowl, and Tech got to keep like half of that?
Yeah, so I actually remember those numbers.
Okay.
What a lot of people don't know or remember is that in the mid-1990s, when CBS signed the Big East Football Conference and the SEC to television contracts, they were basically equal. I think the SEC was $16 million and the Big East was $15 million a year.
Hard to believe.
For the entire conference, which is those numbers are unbelievable. But at that point in time, yeah, the Sugar was paying out something like $8 million for an appearance, and something like half of that would go to the conference, and the other $4 million would go to Virginia Tech. That was big money.
Right. So it was an 8-team Big East Conference. So let's say it's $1 million payout per team if you split it all up evenly. But so you're basically that's a huge difference. You're talking an extra $3 million a year or so if you go to those games. So you do that 2 years in a row, and you do that 3 out of 5 years, and all of a sudden you're building up your finances, and then you've built the Merriman Center, which at the time was the best facility in the country. And then you're expanding the South End Zone. And because you've built up your infrastructure with this newfound money, then when the ACC expands in 2003, boom, you get the invite, right? So again, if Virginia Tech does what it's capable of doing and wins football games, if the athletic department is run well, fundraising goes well, this is a great opportunity for Virginia Tech because as one of the ACC's biggest football brands, like you're going to turn on, like if you break down the ACC in half, Virginia Tech is going to be in your top 4 or 5, 6 teams of teams just for one football game. Who are you going to watch, right? Certainly it's in the top half, especially when you look at the other teams in this league. Well, again, to me, great opportunity for Virginia Tech. It's on the Hokies over the next 5 years to make that work.
Go ahead, Will.
So supposedly, when all this discussion was going on at Florida State, they hired some consultants who presented them with a viewership index, which valued all the different schools in the ACC. And Virginia Tech was 5th best in this viewership index that was presented to Florida State people by a consultant, behind FSU, Clemson, Miami, and oddly enough, Stanford. Then Virginia Tech was 5th. Now, who knows what criteria they were using and how these consultants came up with that. But if that proves out to be true and Virginia Tech gets one of the better revenue share deals in this new agreement based on viewership, then it will be to Virginia Tech's advantage.
So you were talking about opportunity, Chris, for Virginia Tech. And of course, the opportunity now is there, as there has been for years for Virginia Tech football to kind of stabilize itself. But I guess it kind of goes back to the overarching question of how expected was this outcome of this whole dispute back and forth? And now Virginia Tech finds itself in a situation where, hey, if you start to win football games in the next couple of years, more money comes your way, and all of a sudden you can reestablish yourself as a football brand.
I expected some sort of resolution at some point. It wasn't going to drag out till 2036 for sure. I just didn't know what it was going to be.
Well, that was the problem before, is that there was a number that there was a timeline where it was going to extinguish. Like it was way out there.
Right.
It was 2036 or how you want to read it, 2030 or whatever it was. But the number kept getting smaller every time, even if he had to buy out the entire contract.
Yeah.
He was like, oh, it's $700 million now. Okay, well, it's $300 million halfway through that, or $350 halfway through that, which is a lot of money, but if you're desperate enough, you might be willing to pay it. So I think that's part of the thing to remember, at least.
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
I knew where you're going with that.
No.
No.
You're right.
No, great points.
But like I said, I've gone back and forth on how I viewed this thing and whether the ACC should have played hardball and things like that. Ultimately, like Andy said, I think everybody was just tired of dealing with lawsuits. I mean, these days, that's what college sports is one big giant lawsuit. Just wait till a House settlement comes out. Some people think that's going to be the end of it. And I think it's going to be a step in the right direction, but it's going to lead to more lawsuits, right? It's going to. No way around that. So I think if you get a chance to get yourself out of a lawsuit these days, and you can do it reasonably, then you should probably take advantage of that. And I hopefully even get some stability, even if it's just for the next 5 years. But yeah, like we've been talking about, this ride in college sports is nowhere close to being over. There's a lot of change that's still going to happen.
Yeah, and here's the thing. It's like, I think people are making a lot of assumptions about where realignment will go in the future. And like, oh, these teams are definitely leaving the ACC and they're going to get gobbled up by the SEC and Big Ten. Is there an appetite for expansion right now? I mean, these leagues have gotten so big that they're problematic already. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea of, Washington traveling across the country to play at Rutgers in football. It's like, what are we doing with this? I mean, the leagues are so big, you can't even really have a legitimate championship game where you're like, well, you played half the league and you missed half the league. And well, SMU missed a lot of the top teams this year and they're playing in the title game, where some other ones that had a tougher schedule aren't necessarily in that same spot. I think you're already seeing that it's sort of big and unwieldy, and how do you manage it with it? Are you going to go to 24? What's even the point of being a single league at that point? So, at the end of my Q&A that I did with myself on the website today, it's like, what is your prediction for what happens next? I don't think it's expansion necessarily. I think it's consolidation. I think the bigger branded schools band together in some way or another. And it might be initially just sort of, Big Ten, SEC pushing for unequal revenue distribution. So the Michigans and Ohio States of the world get a little bit more. But at a certain point, I think they have to go, why are we dragging these other schools along with us? Why are we sharing this revenue with them when we could do our own thing?
And even those other schools are going to be like, why are we trying to compete against these schools? We're giving them our money to begin with, and then now we're trying to play them, and we're looking in the mirror and saying that it's equal. There's no point in even doing that. Right.
Like at some point, they effectively run college sports as it is. The rules are catered to how the deeper pocketed schools operate. Why don't they just keep that for themselves and create something different? And, I used it in the article and I ran it by Chris because he's a soccer fan, but the English Premier League model where, the top revenue producing clubs, is my understanding, is when this was formed, they sort of broke off and did their own thing. And
that was in 1992. Yeah, this was a long time ago.
Yeah, we're going to keep the money and we're going to play each other and we're going to make even more money. And we don't have to share it with these other people that are just, on your back the whole way, that you're sort of carrying along. So I think, who knows where this whole thing's going to go? Everybody's just taking a guess at this whole thing. But my best guess would be that's the direction it goes eventually. I mean, you've always heard about how things are going to break off and the FBS is going to break away from the FCS. That's already happened, obviously. But the Power Five is going to break away from the Group of Five. It's like, okay, but even within the Power Five, there are differences between the top and the bottom that I think are even more radically different than the Power Five and the Group of Five. So why stop at that delineation there? Go even further and look at the top 16 to 24 brands in the sport. They go off and do their own thing, and I don't know, water kind of finds its level on this whole thing. I think eventually all the schools are going to end up where they belong, and it's a question of where Virginia Tech belongs. Are they in that 24, in that 30, whatever the number would be at the top? I don't know. It's tough to say they are right now, but
it's so hard to say. I think when you look at it, you kind of have to separate things out. You don't necessarily have to look at it from the standpoint of a SEC football conference, or a ACC or Big Ten. Those conferences can exist for other sports, but they don't necessarily have to exist for football.
Right. Football is its own thing.
Yes.
Yeah. I think college sports would be so much better if they just treated football separate.
College football north, college football south. Right? Here's your 20 teams up here. Here's your 20 teteams down here. Whatever you want.
Are you trying to restart the Civil War here?
Yeah, maybe something like that. I don't know. Yeah, I think long term that's what it could end up like, and then your ACC exists for, soccer and baseball and softball and maybe even basketball. I don't know. It would be interesting.
I mean, it's
to see
kind of
where
like just saying it's like a professional model. It's like the NFL.
Yeah.
They have an AFC and an NFC, and they're not north-south, but they are split into regions. Yeah. And I know a lot of people who are like, "Oh man, you're ruining the tradition of college sports." I was like, it's already kind of ruined.
Yes.
Yeah. When they brought Cal and
Stanford and Cal and SMU are playing in this thing, and it's like temporary. Like the whole thing kind of feels like a Ponzi scheme.
When they got rid of rivalries.
Yeah.
It's been ruined.
So
if you think it's ruined, everybody should make their best effort to rebuild it into something that is manageable. and at this point.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to the whole Cal and Stanford conversation. You were talking about consolidating, Andy, and it's like, how sustainable is that whole thing? Like, let's kind of put SMU in its own category, because I think SMU could work, but like Cal and Stanford, with the consolidation factor, I just can't see that lasting long term. And you were talking about the football side of things. We make a big deal, and we meaning, you know, the fan base and the media and whoever, make a big deal out of Virginia Tech going out to Stanford to play in football once every 2 years. I'm going to bring in a bigger, you know, upper echelon conversation. Even like your basketballs of the world, the wear and tear on those guys' and ladies' bodies to go back and forth, especially for the student athletes at Stanford and Cal, every single 2 weeks to the East Coast, I just don't think is going to last. You can look at every single sport.
What about sports that people don't watch? I mean, what's the point of sending the volleyball team out there?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or things like that. I mean, Bill, due respect to volleyball, I'm just being
didn't
like,
UVA just cancel a program, like one of their sports?
Diving.
Yeah.
Aren't they good in diving?
Yeah.
Like, aren't they actually
I
pretty
have
good?
no idea, but like you're going to
good in
see
a lot of
sports get canceled. Stanford and Cal was about vote buying.
Sure.
To make sure the ACC had enough votes lined up with
three schools left,
Florida State and
something like
Clemson. Yeah, so that was easy. It was like, we don't have to really pay you anything. You're just happy to be here, so you're going to vote whatever direction Jim Phillips tells you to vote. I think that's what the whole Cal-Stanford thing was mainly about.
plus they got them at a pretty good discount.
Right. I don't see Virginia Tech playing Stanford and Cal regularly in anything 10 years from now. That's my opinion.
I don't either. And, you know, the volleyball point is definitely a good one, because you look at pretty much every single other sport. And I even threw basketball in there because I don't think there's a need for basketball to go out there. But like those sports, like there is a sport at Virginia Tech. And if you really want to figure it out, you can look it up. There is a sport at Virginia Tech, and Nick and I talked about it a couple weeks ago, that is going out to the West Coast in a couple weeks to just play Stanford because Cal doesn't have a program in that sport. Like, that's I just don't think that's something that should last long term.
This isn't the first time. It shouldn't be happening these days. Virginia Tech used to be in the Metro Conference, right? Here's your history lesson. But back in the 1980s, so like Tulane was in the Metro. Southern Miss was in the Metro. Virginia Tech baseball would bus to New Orleans, play a series against Tulane, and then on the way back, stop and play a series against Southern Miss. You talk about the bus leagues, like minor league baseball, like Bull Durham and things like that. That's crazy, right? But back then, like Virginia Tech didn't even have the money to fly their teams to places like that, at least for the Olympic sports. I think I think the travel to the West Coast is silly, but I also think at some point it's not going to be happening anymore.
Yeah,
because eventually everybody will come to their senses and put football in this box and put everybody else in the other box.
Well, everything was done for TV viewership numbers, right? The TV contracts. But what are the sports that people watch on TV? It's basketball and it's football.
Sure.
So why are you dragging along the other sports to have to make this ridiculous travel for games that probably aren't going to get a whole lot of viewership on TV? It just doesn't make sense. I think the other thing is, I've talked about consolidation, and I feel like in the past maybe there was sort of a tie to tradition, and like I would never imagine Ohio State or Michigan would want to leave the Big Ten or anything like that. But what is the Big Ten now? Half the Big Ten is Rutgers, Maryland,
Purdue,
Washington,
Oregon, USC, UCLA. That's 6 teams in the Big Ten that don't feel like the Big Ten. So what are they leaving if they would leave at this point? So they're not leaving
Nebraska.
They're not leaving what the idea of the Big Ten was. And this was, I go back to this all the time because I thought it was a very poignant part of that Requiem for the Big East documentary that was on. I think that's what it was called, the 30 for 30.
It was, yeah.
And they were interviewing Jim Boeheim, and they're like, oh my gosh, Syracuse decided to leave for the ACC. How could you leave the Big East? They had Boeheim on. He's like, because this wasn't the Big East. This wasn't what it was back in its heyday when it was, basketball league, everybody up in the Northeast. I mean, it's got DePaul and all these other weird
Creighton,
teams. South Florida's in it. Like it wasn't what it was. We're not leaving this idea of what you had it was. So
most of the Big East is gone. Like it was in the ACC.
It is, yeah.
So now the thought of some of these schools, like, oh, how could you ever leave the Big Ten? The Michigan would never leave the Big Ten, or Ohio State would never. It's like, I think now there's chipped away at this idea of what the Big Ten was. Maybe it's a little more possible of what it was if they want to join something bigger or, team up with the other power brands that are out there and, basically print money in whatever new league they would form.
I think if Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State were all, as long as they were all together, like I don't think they would care if they left Purdue behind.
No. Oh, absolutely not. I was saying in the past, maybe there was that faction or that tinge of nostalgia that's like, we don't want to leave this thing. This thing's been around 100 years. Yeah. And then you look at the Pac-12 and it was around 100 years and then broken up in, 100 minutes last year. So things changed. I think the landscape has changed and maybe things that were thought outrageous a couple years ago maybe don't seem so outrageous now.
Yeah, no doubt about that. It is quite the interesting conversation. And, one thing I wanted to slip in that Nick just texted me that is a very good point. The one thing that the ACC, away from football, and I get football, attracts 90% of the conversation. But the one thing the ACC has going for it is you have major, major basketball brands in Duke and North Carolina. How much does the viewership of those two programs maybe have any effect on how the ACC handles the situation with its television rights and what's going on legally?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. Carolina's a bigger brand. Like Duke's a great basketball program, but they don't have Jordan.
Right. Yes.
And they have a smaller alumni base than North Carolina. Even they're a better program.
And Carolina's a state school too.
For sure. So I don't know. I mean, I think the Carolina brand would be appealing because of kind of everything. It's like they're not bad at football, they're not great at it, but they can be better than they have been. Mm-hmm. I think with the right hires, which I'm not convinced they've made this time. But when just the Nike Michael Jordan emblem, makes them more attractive than Duke, I would think.
Does Duke bring you the New York, New Jersey market based on the enrollment options out? Mm-hmm. Not seriously, but sure. I think it's an interesting thing because basketball is sort of brought along for the ride in this whole thing. Mm-hmm. It's always about football first with this stuff. So, I don't know. I don't know how they factor that in. I'd love to see how they're going to break down. I don't know if they'll make this public, but how they're going to break down the viewership and how they weight that with football and basketball in the same pot. And then, and how do you break that down into the money?
What
terms?
Do you do with the NCAA tournament? So let's say your top 30 football schools break away and they've got their own contract, and all of a sudden they have so much money that their basketball players are just better, way better than anybody. So it waters down doesn't water it down, but it makes it very difficult for anybody else to compete in the NCAA tournament. What happens to the NCAA tournament? Would there be two different NCAA basketball tournaments at some point? I really have no idea. I can't answer that question.
I don't know. I don't know if we're getting to that point. It feels like the basketball. It feels like the talent in basketball is dispersed as ever. And while there are good teams, you can still. There are good teams. I think the issue is that when you have really, really good players at these really good teams, they leave for the NBA early. So you don't build them up over in that smaller roster. You can kind of spread your NIL around. I think if you have a team that plays together for a while, and that's a tough thing to do in these days because somebody's always getting pulled up by a bigger pocket at school. I think there's an opportunity there to create some situations where Dayton was really good for a while, or where some other mid majors that were right up there in the Final Four discussion for a lot of those years. I think they're just with smaller rosters like that. I think there's better ways to distribute your money and compete. Football is just a machine, though. It's just like you're going to whip together a 100-person roster and pay everybody enough to have the depth and the talent to compete like that. I think that is so weighted towards the bigger brands that it's tougher to get a foothold and compete in football than perhaps it is in basketball.
There's a reason that back in the late 70s, early 80s, Division I broke away and became FBS and FCS. Mm-hmm. It's because like Virginia Tech and VMI. They didn't have any business. It was tough to ask Vanderbilt to offer the same amount of scholarships as Virginia Tech, right? And yet still compete with them on the playing field every year. So the split has already happened. The split happened before I was born, certainly before y'all were born. And but as you go through time, now there's going to be another split. And it's just a matter of how many times it gets split. But we've already seen splits happen. It was just the first one happened just a long, long time ago, and most people just don't remember it.
So are we heading towards an ACC in 2032 that doesn't have Florida State, Clemson, maybe Miami, maybe North Carolina, and the replacements are to a lower extent kind of like what the Pac-12 did with, I don't know, East Carolina, Memphis, whatever, South Florida, whatever it may be.
Maybe, but it's just as possible that like no football, like there is no SEC football conference at some point. There is no Big Ten football conference at some point. It's like those conferences exist for, basketball and soccer and baseball and other sports, but your football is a legit professional model. There's just as much a chance of that happening.
I just scrap it all and go straight promotion relegation. Yeah. Just all on results. Back it up on the field and you can move up and you don't.
Florida
move
State
down.
relegated.
I think that'd be awesome.
Can you hear about Florida State relegated this past year? That would have been awesome. Of course, Tech would have been relegated in 2022. So.
I think that'd be a good way to do it. Then you get back what you're putting into your teams. I think that's a cool way to do it. There's challenges because there are the rosters turn over so much in college sports, but now that you're essentially paying the players, you can put that back into the program and have really good teams, even though people will time out and graduate and move on to the next level. I think that'd be an interesting way to do it.
Did I miss anything on this whole deal with Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC? Is there anything else that you would like to touch on?
I'm sure we've all missed something.
Yeah, I know. I just want
we're all sort of guessing at what it means.
Sure.
I think we have an idea, maybe, but anybody that knows what the next iteration of conference realignment is going to look like, where there's this tidal wave of the House settlement coming, and all of a sudden revenue sharing is going to be included in this whole thing, and you just know how the chips are going to land after this whole thing and the dust settles in this whole thing. I don't know that anybody knows for sure, so we're sort of guessing at what direction it goes, but I know sometimes you can make some educated guesses, and I'm sure we'll look back at this and be laughing at how off base we were in this whole thing.
Yeah, it's going to be like looking back at like past recruiting classes. Oh, got that one right. Got that one way wrong though.
Devin Hunter turned into a ball player.
Oh, yeah,
exactly.
So to go back to something Andy was talking about earlier, he said Florida State and Clemson got increased share of revenue, which is what they wanted. They got a specific number on exiting the league, which is also what they wanted. And they also got the grant of rights neutered, which is a third thing that they wanted. In all of this discussion, and I don't have the answer to this, television drives all of this. What does television want? What are they going to want in 5 or 6 years when all these media contracts need to be renewed? What is television going to want at that point in time? I'm not sure they even have an idea right now, because one of the things they're doing is they've created this college football playoff. And they're learning things about it every time they do it.
They're going to tweak it yearly.
They've learned they need to seed better. I think they've learned that it shouldn't run into the NFL playoffs.
I would agree with that.
Because a lot of people, by the time the NCAA, the college football playoff championship game came around, their head had gone over to the NFL. And I'm not even an NFL fan, but that same kind of thing happened to me. The college football playoff went on a little bit too long. They're also learning a lot about the ratings that they're getting for the different rounds of games. So they're still in the data taking stage. And I don't think even television really knows what they're going to want 5 or 6 years from now.
As always, Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. This episode of the Tech Sideline Podcast is also brought to you by the Hokie Way. The Hokie Way's 2025 auction begins April 1st with over 100 entries for you to bid on. Registration starts March 15th at thehokieway.org, so do not miss this auction. There are going to be some fantastic packages and items up for bid. So just before we close it out, kind of some news hot off the press today. Andy and I were kind of talking about it before we started recording. The offseason has kind of not really happened because of, a 6-week defensive coordinator search, and then Tyler Bowen leaves all of a sudden. And now we finally got some answers to some shuffling on the staff, as well as some additions as well. So what are kind of some of your takeaways there, and what should we look for with this new group coming in here in 2025?
No big surprise. A lot of the things we heard were going to happen did happen. Like, it seems like the defensive line has been split up with J.C. Price, the defensive line coach, but there's also an edge coach now. A couple defensive assistants who either played for or coached under Sam Seifkes at previous stops, so there's familiarity with his scheme and what he wants to do. Not as much turnover on the offensive side, which isn't surprising because they hired an offensive line coach before the offensive coordinator change, right? So, and obviously any new offensive coordinator, he might want to bring in some new guys on his own staff, but you can't really do that. You've already hired your offensive line coach. You absolutely cannot change Fontel Mines or Elijah Brooks, so there's very limited change that you can have on the offensive side of the ball. But the change we saw on defense is about what we expected, and I'm writing a column about this for tomorrow. What they've got to figure out is which assistants are out on the road recruiting, and I'm going to be really interested to see what things look like in the spring, especially on defense. So you've got a nickels coach. Mm-hmm. You've got a safeties coach. You've got an outside linebackers coach. You've got an edge coach. So how are those edges? How much are they outside linebackers? How much are those outside linebackers, quasi nickels safeties? There's a lot of bleed over from position to position. I doubt they'll even release an official depth chart in the spring. We'll just have to go out there and guess.
I don't think have they in the past? I can't remember.
Not recently. This staff hasn't.
Yeah, I guess for people that hadn't heard, we should probably tell them who the changes were.
That's a good point.
Brian Whitehead and the nickels coach. Jeray Wilson is the edges coach. Jens Danielson, is that how you pronounce that?
I don't know. That's a good question.
That's probably Jens. That looks
he's got a son named Ram. That's a surefire football player.
Yeah, that's great. He's the assistant offensive line coach, and then Cannon Montgomery, the son of Philip Montgomery, assistant running backs coach. Some shifts within the previous coaching duties. Brent Davis on tight ends. Stu Holt is now a special teams coordinator. It says assistant offensive coach. Or offensive assistant. So sort of I guess, roving something or other. It will be involved somehow because they're not doing special teams all the time when they're out there. Sean Quinn, outside linebackers coach, and Xavier Debe, inside linebackers coach. This is all of a sudden a very big staff because they didn't, jettison anybody in this yet that we know of. And, at this point, I don't think they will.
I don't think so.
I think there'll be some shuffling of duties, and as obviously they have, and some shuffling of recruiting duties because you can only have 10 on the road. So who's going to be on the road? Who's not going to be on the road? I think they're still figuring that out, and what the NCAA rules allow is to can you switch those up midway through the year? Do they have to be static for the entire year? Who recruits and who doesn't? So those are some questions for Brent Pry next. But I mean, this is a very large staff with, coaches at a lot of very specific positions, assistant coaches at a lot of positions out there. I think the rule that allows those off-field guys, to be able to coach, even though they were coaching before, but now to be able to officially coach, I think it opens up some possibilities with this. So you're going to have familiarity in the scheme, which is why I think a couple of these guys are brought in on, familiarity with the staff, which is why I think the assistant offensive line coach comes on. And obviously Cannon Montgomery knows his dad pretty well. Sure. I don't think we have to dig too deep of why that hire was made. Not to say it should have been hired, but that's, a good connection there. So interesting setup to the staff, and I'm curious how this all plays out and works on the practice field.
Yeah, all 5 new staff members have a connection to either Philip Montgomery, Matt Moore, or Sam Seifkes. Is that correct? Believe so.
That sounds right.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
That sounds right.
Well, Danielson was to Matt Moore.
To Matt Moore,
West Virginia. Sure. Yeah, the offseason kind of happened, kind of didn't, but spring ball is coming up here in a couple weeks. And yes, again, Virginia Tech has made some shuffling, I should say, on the staff. And Will, you got something in the fourth chair?
Do we know when spring practice starts? Because we know that the spring game is April 12th.
Oh, it was at April 13th. I thought it was.
Yeah, it's the next week is spring
April
break
12th.
for Virginia Tech, so it's going to be the weekend, the week after that. I don't know if it's Wednesday, Thursday, sometime around then, middle of the week of the 17th through the 22nd sometime. Okay. I don't know if there's an exact date, but that's an approximation of where it is.
By the way, real fast, what are y'all's takeaways on these spring games getting canceled across the country? What is your take on this whole situation?
It's overreaction.
Yeah. I mean, you think this is going to stop people from poaching other rosters? Well, you don't think at some point during spring ball, just because the spring game isn't televised, that word's going to get out, not going to get out there that somebody's standing out in practice.
Do you really think that there are coaching staffs around the country watching spring games and deciding from watching a spring game, oh, we should try to poach that guy?
If that were the case, Pop Watson would never have been at Virginia Tech based on that spring game his true freshman year.
It's just
Nobody would have wanted Michael Vick.
Tell me whether or not you agree with this. I think football coaches just don't like spring games, and they'd rather have it be a conventional practice.
Yeah, I think so.
And this is giving them the excuse.
And this is the reason, right?
This is giving them the excuse. I think it's short-sighted because I think there are benefits to the spring game beyond whatever takes place on the field. I mean, most coaches just want to get through it without an injury more than anything. And they're sort of, bitch and moan about not having that 15th evaluation opportunity of the spring. It's like, you know what? Go out there and have some fun for your fans. These schools are asking so much in terms of donations, and you got to donate to be able to buy seats. You need to donate to NIL. Do you care about the team if you're not donating the stuff? And schools are taking away more and more opportunities from them to see the thing. From the end of the season until the season ramps up, like Fan Day in August or whatever, the spring game is sort of the one opportunity that a lot of fans will have to be able to watch the game or watch their team practice. It's usually nice weather. You just want to get outside. If I'm bringing my kids, it's probably easier to go to a spring game that's quick and informal like that than trying to get
anywhere you want.
Yeah, park anywhere you want. Bring them down here for a regular season game. That is a chore to try to get them to sit through 3 hours of a game, then however much tailgating, and then whatever traffic you have to get in and out of it. It's a real low stakes opportunity, I think, for a lot of these schools to build the next generation of fans. And they're going to shut people out from that at a lot of schools and just like turn your backs on that opportunity. I think it's a mistake that they're doing it. And I hope Virginia Tech doesn't cancel it because I think it's one of the great events they have here in the spring.
Virginia Tech's going to actually charge for the spring game this year over here, so they're going to make money off of it.
Yeah, which they did prize first year, I believe.
I don't remember, but
$5.
I agree with Andy 100%. I think when's the last time something was done in college sports for the benefit of the fans? And who is actually the most important people in college sports? The fans. Because all this revenue, in some cases, it's the fans paying the players directly these days. But all this revenue that is created is generated by fan support. But yet nobody does anything for the fans. So they just everybody wants more money. They need more money. We're doing these huge playoffs now. So if you're a playoff team, you have to actually make 2 or 3 road trips in the month.
You could potentially travel 4 times in the postseason.
Right, exactly.
Like, that's a lot. It's a commitment to be able to do that stuff. Sure. I feel like this is just like unnecessary cutting for something that, like, it's sure it might happen that somebody blows up in the spring games. Like, oh my gosh, they're going to be, transfer portal. People are going to be coming after that guy. Mostly, I think it's sort of figments of the coach's imagination here that they're paranoid people when it comes to protecting their roster. I think this is maybe taking it to the extreme here.
Yeah, I agree. I hope Virginia Tech never does it. It's one of my favorite weekends of the year. You have all the donor events too over the weekend, all the folks coming in town. It's a huge economic opportunity for Blacksburg. Like it's
usually around the Remembrance Run.
Yes, it is. Great point.
For Virginia Tech specifically, it's a pretty important
It also helps out like the baseball and softball programs too when they're winning because you can get the crowds that you're hoping to get.
When it comes down to it, it's weird that like you can choose to opt out of a spring game. Basically, can you imagine like an NFL coach saying, "Well, I don't want anybody to figure out my depth, so I'm going to opt out of this 3rd preseason game." You can't do that, right? Like it's a built-in rule. You have to play these games, so everybody should either have to play the spring game or nobody should play the spring.
If you're a head coach and you can't sandbag a spring game, are you even a coach in college football?
Exactly.
Like, figure out a way.
That's like the first thing on your application.
Come up with a phantom injury for your star player or something like that if you don't want him to go out. I mean, you typically do that anyway. If somebody has a hangnail, they're not going to play in that game. But if you're like, oh man, this guy's going to break out, just don't throw him the ball a whole bunch. I covered a spring game at Auburn where they sort of hid the talents of Cam Newton. It didn't work very well. Everybody saw through that ruse very well, but they did manage to do it on the on-field production. So if they can do that for one of the greatest, single season players in college football history like that, I think you can figure out how to do it on your 4th string running back that you don't want to lose to an better NIL deal somewhere else. So.
I would hope so. So that's coming up in 5 weekends, so it's coming up pretty fast. So what is coming up on TechSideline.com? I know there's plenty coming up with spring football, ACC men's and women's basketball tournaments, and then baseball and softball as well.
Andy had a great Q&A today. I've got an article on the coaching staff tomorrow, offense, defense, and potential recruiting responsibilities. And then a normal Friday Q&A from me.
I am trying to figure out when I'm going to talk to Bayshall Tootin next to talk about his combine performance, which was sort of a big deal. Did pretty well at that, ran very well, tested out well among the running backs. We'll see how much that moves the needle, if it's actually like this difference maker in the draft process, but it's certainly an interesting story to follow. I took some mailbag queries earlier this week, and then I sort of got sidetracked with this Q&A thing that I wrote today. So I don't know if I'll write a mailbag from what I had, maybe save it for next week. Or I was thinking of doing a mailbag. Every now and then I get questions sort of about the journalism side of covering Virginia Tech or working at Tech Sideline like that. I thought, during spring break where there's not a ton going on, maybe that's the best time to run one where it's just like, just ask me about the business and covering Virginia Tech or my experiences. That might be a good time to do it. I'll decide next week how I'm going to play that out, though.
Nice.
Yeah, I do that every year when Chris goes over to Europe. I do a Friday Q&A, call it Inside TSL, and people ask me questions about Tech Sideline.
Cool.
And I give away way too much inside information.
What about you, Nick? What's coming up on the video side of things over the next week or so?
Hopefully Matt Moore tomorrow. He's a busy man, so we're trying to work him in here tomorrow, and then Friday Q&A on Friday, and that should be it for the week.
Nice. Hokies in Greensboro tomorrow on the women's side and at Clemson on the men's side. So, all right, that'll do it. Episode 412 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. Talked all things on the ACC, new staff additions for the Hokies, and plenty more coming up over the next couple of weeks. So, for Chris Coleman, Andy Bitter, Will Stewart, Nick Brown, I'm Carter Hill saying so long from Blacksburg, and we'll talk to you very soon.